Hi, I'm Vince Gaffney. I'm an archaeologist from the University of Birmingham. I think I've got one of the best careers you could possibly have. Archaeology is fundamentally a two cultures discipline. It brings in everything. It goes all the way from study of pottery and art, all the way through to hard science, absolute dating, paleo-environmental studies, spatial statistics, computational analysis. It just about covers everything, and it means that you have a real concept of how to study man and his works. I've been fortunate in doing this work now for more than 20 years, and it's taken me into areas that I could never possibly have imagined I'd have been able to study in, both in Africa, Europe, America, and the breadth of societies that I've been able to look at. Hunter-gatherers, complex societies, Rome and her empire, the Greeks. I don't think that you could find a discipline that does quite so much. How did I become an archaeologist? Well, you probably might guess from my accent that I'm a Geordie. Well, I'm from the city of Newcastle upon Tyne, or as it was called, Ponzilius, the Roman settlement which stood on the site 2,000 years ago. And when I went to school in the morning, I walked along Hadrian's Wall. When I got to school, I was actually studying above a Roman fort. It was possibly inevitable that I was going to be interested in history and ultimately archaeology. It surrounded me from my very earliest memories, and I've always loved it.
I started off looking at Roman villas in their landscape context, and that really hooked me onto landscape. But after a brief change of careers into museums, I felt I had to go back to archaeology. I did a PhD in former Yugoslavia. I came back to Britain. I carried out landscape research in Britain, in Italy, in Croatia, America, North and Southern Africa. One of the projects I'm currently engaged in is looking at the landscapes which exist under the North Sea. Perhaps many people don't realise, but until about 6,000 years ago, 6 to 7,000 years ago, the current area of the southern North Sea was actually dry land. It was inhabited by hunter-gatherers and who roamed across pretty much the whole of the area between Yorkshire and Denmark. However, of course, global warming, the end of the Ice Age, rising sea levels meant that this landscape was actually swallowed up by the sea over time, and it was pretty much lost to knowledge. About 6 to 7 years ago, we started a project using oil data collected by the oil industry from seismics, actually, to start mapping this lost landscape. And the results have actually been wonderful. Currently we've mapped rivers, hills, lakes, marshes, over an area of about 23,000 square kilometres. That's an entirely new prehistoric country, in fact, and we're now starting to try and use
nearly 10 years now. Now we're about to do something different. From going from a map which has nothing on, essentially apart from rivers, hills, lakes, coastlines, we're going to take ships, we're going to core down river valleys, and we're going to extract DNA, paleoenvironmental evidence, and create huge models of colonisation and decolonisation of this land after the Ice Age, with sea level rising, temperature rising, plants moving in, animals following plants, people following the animals, and we're going to do it over an area of about 60 to 90,000 square kilometres, most of which cannot be explored by archaeology using conventional means. The introduction of farming is set against a scene of dramatic change globally. Much of the evidence that we need to find lies beneath the sea. But that's also a great thing as well, because the conditions underneath the sea actually preserve evidence far better than on land. So we're able to seek out the evidence, dive, extract the sediments that we want to analyse and use those. So it's a real challenge, but it's a fantastic opportunity. Remarkably, our colleagues at Warwick, using new technologies to extract DNA from sediments taken from Boulder Cliff, have been able to create a much better picture of the paleoenvironment around the site. What was surprising was that there was evidence for einkorn wheat. Wheat, of course, is a signature for farming, but this is 2,000 years before the onset of farming in Britain, and at this time, traditionally, the nearest farmers were either in the south of France or possibly as far away as the Balkans, thousands of miles across continental Europe. So how did...
It started with literally Vince and myself in a field next to Stonehenge and just saying, wouldn't it be great to do a huge area?
It's given us a really unique insight into this Stonehenge landscape. With collaborators from around Europe, we've been able to look in between the monuments, not just the places that people usually look, in order to create a data set of a type British archaeology and indeed world archaeology has never seen in respect of a wonderful and uniquely important archaeological monument.
I think one of the most exciting things are just the tiny little monuments that actually sometimes exist between the monuments that we know. So we've got little henges, which are probably chapels that people visited en route to Stonehenge. We've seen some sites that are within other sites, are hidden away. So we sort of completely recharacterized parts of the landscape that we just didn't really understand. But the larger scale?
Oh, I think the other thing that comes out of this is Stonehenge, and to most archaeologists, is somewhere that's set apart. It's revered. People possibly didn't come close to it, except perhaps special people at special times. But the new data, because we can look everywhere in the landscape, is starting to suggest that there was a lot going on in the landscape. There may have been processions, large numbers of people may have turned up, actually, but you can't see that just by digging small holes in monuments, some of which stretch for 3 kilometres across the landscape. The finds that we've made in the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project really do change how we view Stonehenge. It no longer sits isolated in the centre of a plain. We found about 17 new late Neolithic monuments of the period of the great phases of Stonehenge, and monuments which are like Stonehenge, smaller in scale perhaps, but nonetheless intimately linked with the stones themselves and representing what must have been smaller ritual shrines or something of that sort. When we've finished this project, when the data's been processed, and that's only a matter of days really, we will produce the first substantive map of the landscape of Stonehenge, touching every part of the landscape rather than the bits we knew about already. And that is going to fundamentally change how we view the most important archaeological monument in Britain and probably the world.
Advancements in the technology for investigating archaeological landscapes by the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute made it possible to explore the entire hidden landscape at a high resolution, starting in 2010. By mounting a wide array of equipment to vehicles such as quad bikes, and by linking the collection of data to GPS satellite navigation, it was possible to undertake a survey at a scale and resolution that had never been attempted before. It became possible for the first time to get additional information about known sites within the landscape and to fill in the gaps between monuments. A total of approximately 12 hectares was surveyed between 2010 and 2014. The ambitions of the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project were achieved through European cooperation, with an international team directed by the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute and the University of Birmingham, and involving the universities of Bradford, Vienna, St Andrews and Ghent. The principal methods used were magnetometry, measuring variations in the magnetic properties of the soil, and ground-penetrating radar, which provides 3D imagery of buried features. Other geophysical methods were also used, including sub-decimeter topographic laser scanning of the entire landscape of Stonehenge. This project has shown that it is not possible to appreciate the significance of Stonehenge itself without understanding the landscape around it. The high-resolution survey of the known monuments around Stonehenge has significantly increased the level of knowledge about them, in many cases allowing us to identify different phases of construction and presenting quite different interpretations to those previously held. By surveying the areas between the upstanding monuments, the project has revealed a multi-period landscape far from the empty space previously imagined. This includes a range of new monuments contemporary with Stonehenge, including similar, though smaller, hengiform sites. We can now see a landscape dotted with numerous smaller temple sites constructed of wood, stone and earth, surrounding the larger site of Stonehenge. The increased knowledge about the hidden landscape of Stonehenge has meant that it is now possible to explore the evolution of the landscape through time and how the different monuments might have been used.
What else would I like as an archaeologist? What discovery, what new knowledge could I imagine that we might anticipate would be useful to us in the future? Well, there's many things that we could consider. Many of them wishful, the ultimate remote sensing device to see everything under the soil. Well, I'm not sure that's going to come in the near future. However, the future development of DNA studies. Now, that is an area of interest. Up till now, DNA studies have been very expensive. They've largely been linked to understanding the development of humans themselves. Well, now that DNA is almost becoming a mass industry, we're getting to the point that we should be able to use archaeological sediments to characterize entire landscapes. And we're on the verge of that. This is something that isn't quite there yet, but it is very, very close to being reality. And when we can do that, perhaps we can be able to recreate landscapes in their entirety, not just the bits that we have at the moment, the people, the plants, the animals, the microorganisms as well. When we do that, we'll have a much better picture of what the past was really like.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and a special thanks go to a long-standing colleague of ours, Vince Gaffney, who made quite a lot of his career in former Yugoslavia, especially in Dalmatia, in Croatia, some in Slovenia. Since our theme, the theme of our dialogues, is some sort of a reflection on the developments of archaeology in this region, Vince Gaffney was simply a person who one must ask, address, to share with us his experiences, his impressions, and memories, of course, because there are 3 decades or even more, the time the Vince spent on and off in doing research here. Hi, Vince.
Hi there, Predrag.
I wanted to ask you, before we start, 2 serious questions about Stonehenge. Since you got the honorary citizen of Stonehenge, how you say in Stonehengian, oh no, geophysics again?
It's here to stay. You know, yeah. Along with solstices.
And the other one was, well, I couldn't escape seeing a lot of cow shit on a frame for geophysics.
I mean, the computers were very badly hurt by that. If you travel across a field filled with cows at 30 or 40 kilometers an hour, the effect is shattering.
It affected the aesthetics of those frames, definitely. I couldn't escape.
I mean, what people also didn't see, that was because of the speed at which we were doing it. The pressures built up within the frames of the sensors, and at one point, one of them exploded in front of us. I mean, literally, fell apart. It was amazing.
First part we will, of course, dedicate to your experiences and impressions and memories, how you start working in our region here. And of course, the first question just needs to be asked. How you get in contact with people like Božidar and others to come to Slovenia first and then to extend your work? It was in the mid-80s.
It was earlier than that, actually. It was at a conference on conceptual issues in environmental archaeology in the earlier 80s in Oxford, where I met Božidar through John Bindliffe. And at that point in time, I think it was about 84, at that point in time, I was in museums because I'd gone to museums as a shelter, because when Margaret Thatcher came to power, she cut so much funding for archaeology. I thought, time to get out for a while. So I got a job in a small museum just south of Birmingham, and I loved it. I had a great time. I was running my own water mill.
Tell people what museum was.
It was the National Needle Museum, which is fine for a while because the town Redditch I worked in at one point produced more than 90% of the world's needles, and it was all powered by water in water mills for a long time. Now I have my own 18th century water mill to play with, but I had to leave when my brother called me the biggest prick in the collection. That was time to leave. You know, when people make fun of you at that level, you've got to leave. That's a job you have to leave. So, but I wanted to go back to archaeology. I've been to this conference where I'd met Božidar. I'd recently I was publishing on field survey, Roman rural settlement field survey in the Berkshire Downs, a place called Maddle Farm, and Božidar thought that some of the things that we developed as part of that project in terms of understanding Roman economies could be usefully transferred to Slovenia, and particularly into the Slovene karst, where he was working at Rodic at the time. And he asked whether I might come over, and I wanted to do a PhD by then, and I decided to do that. I then had to get money for it. You know, the usual problem of archaeology. We all have great ideas, but getting money for it. And there was a cunning plan. We had a cunning plan. I think John Bindliffe suggested to it that I applied to the British Council, who gave out grants at that point for academics working in various places, one of which was for former Yugoslavia. So I applied, there were two things wrong with this. One, I applied for a 1 year's grant, and they didn't respond after about a year. They hadn't responded, so I applied again, and I turned up, and then I got an invitation to interview in London, in the heart of Whitehall. I mean, I can't tell you, I've never seen so many oak-panelled rooms in my life. So when I went down to this place to meet these civil servants, and I got into this room with venerable old men in front of me, and they said, you appear to have applied for this this grant. I said, yes. And they said, there seems to be a problem. I said, what's that? And they said, you've applied for it twice. And I said, well, yes. And they said, well, how do you do that? I said, I've applied for the second year on the basis of the first year's results. And they said, but we haven't funded the first year's work. And I said, exactly. And they said, could you leave the room for a moment? I had to leave the room. They came back, they brought me back in and said, well, we couldn't possibly give you 2 years' money, despite the fact they'd taken a year to even talk to me. They said, we can't do this, it's under no circumstances, but we will give you 1 year and 11 months funding. So I said, fine. So I headed off. Because then the second problem became apparent, because the detail of these grants was then, if a Yugoslav came to Britain, they got the national average salary. And the same applied for me going to Yugoslavia. And I thought that must be brilliant, because the national average salary was more than I was earning in any case in Britain. But it was only when I got to Yugoslavia that I realized that the national salary in Yugoslavia was a lot different, and nobody could actually survive on it. I mean, the good friends like Božidar, who took me under his wing and has helped me survive in this area in Yugoslavia, actually got me through. It was the first of a set of culture shocks that I had in order to be able to learn to work in Yugoslavia. It was quite an adventure. I'd never worked outside of Britain before. I barely worked outside of Newcastle upon Tyne, where I was born. So it was really quite a big jump for me.
Yes, I can imagine it must have been a shock for you to come to a country that probably you have no idea how it looked, how life it looked in reality, and probably you started to learn the Yugoslav way of life in the 80s.
Absolutely. I mean, the moment I arrived, and people will remember well, was the first thing that happened was the Yugoslav customs impounded my computer and Božidar's car, because my computer was in his car. So his car and my computer were taken to the customs in Ljubljana, and it was kept there for about 6 or 7 weeks. And I had to go to the customs office every morning at 7 o'clock and wait till about 2 o'clock in the evening, and for weeks, until they eventually said that I could have my computer back. I'd never met bureaucracy like this before. It was really an eye opener.
Mm. Well, anyway, you survived the first few months. You start get used to the way how the things work, and at a certain point you have changed your initial theme for a PhD from Slovenia to Croatia. You moved from Slovenian cars to Dalmatian cars, so to say.
Absolutely right. I mean, I got there, and I think it was notable that the moment I arrived, a good chunk of the staff at Ljubljana left. I don't think that was deliberate, but Biber Dejan went to Berlin, so that people went on long terms away from the university. So I was there. I really didn't know what to do at first, because it did seem that my ability to work in the Slovene course was not likely to happen. Now, I managed to meet people who became very important to me. Daria Grossman was one of those people. Zoran was a young researcher. I met you a bit later, I think, Predrag, from that. I was working in Tabachna, in the little outstation from the department, doing, beginning to learn a bit about what things were about in Yugoslavia. And Božidar, after a while, said, "You know what? It might be an idea if we change the research area." He said, "We're doing this project down in Croatia on an island called Hvar." At which point I said, "Where?" And he said, "Perhaps you'd better go and have a look." And so I went down to down to Dalmatia on the overnight train, which was wonderful. It was like traveling in true Austro-Hungarian carriages. I remember that. It was absolutely wonderful. The train slipped down the Dinaric Alps at one point, backwards, because the brakes didn't work. We got down there. I met Branko Kirigan, who took me out to the islands, and rather like the last temptation, the final temptation of Christ, he took me onto a high place above the Starigrad plain, pointed out all the hill forts, the Greek field systems, where the villas were, some of which were standing to nearly 2 stories high, of course, in some places, and said, "Would you like to work here?" And I think it took me about a nanosecond to make that decision. Where do I sign? Yes, please. So the decision was that I would be.
It must have been sexier than a model farm.
It was, yeah, exactly. It wasn't cold, it wasn't wet, and it had wine and it had rakia. I mean, and great archaeology. It was another world. So I was shunted down there. The bizarre situation of being in a social economy was that instead of, despite having, as I've said, no money, and the hyperinflation was growing during the period I was there, I was put up in hotels for almost the entire period, because that's what you could do then. So every evening I was eating a meal with someone playing a serenade on the piano whilst I was eating. So it was all a bit surreal, I have to say. But then, of course, I managed to start meeting people in the area. Branko was the introduction, but the Mirjana Konvic and the local heritage centre, Marinko Petric, and I think I'd have to point out Nikša Vojnovic, who became my minder. He looked after me and made sure I didn't do anything particularly stupid. I did plenty that was stupid, but not particularly stupid. And he opened the way into all the villages and in the region, so that we could start to think about what to do with the archaeology of the island.
Just to stop you here, just for the colleagues who don't know Branko Kirigin, you have a presentation, an older photo below the cameras, and you see Vince and Branko Kirigin, who worked as a curator at the Archaeological Museum in Split. I believe now he's retired for some 5 years. Yes, and Branko Kirigin was the key person actually to open your institutional doors in Dalmatia.
Yes, and the consequence of that were 2 things. In the first instance, because I was attached to the University of Bradford as a potential PhD student at this point, it was also a chance to start tying together some specific types of work. The most important of which was to start a field survey on the Starigrad plain. Now, there'd been a lot of people working on the Starigrad plain. Branko, obviously, Petar Popovic in Belgrade, and Božidar. They'd effectively had a project Hvar from 1981, I think it was. But this was a chance to restart this survey in a very formal manner on the Starigrad plain itself, where the great Greek field systems were located, and that initially allowed us to look at the conditions of how you might do survey in a very, very quite an extreme, in some senses, limestone environment. And I will point out my total lack of experience here. I mean, critical stupidity was how you might have defined it. I mean, I turned up to do an excavation on to work on an excavation with Branko at Maslinovic, the Greek tower on Hvar, where he was working with Petar Popovic, and I demanded a bucket to try and do some excavation whilst I was there. Where's the buckets? I said to use so I can shovel stuff into. Well, they were very polite, and they found me a bucket. There was no buckets on site, but they found me a bucket. And then I realised there's no earthly way you can shovel big rocks, limestone rubble into a bucket. Nobody used buckets because they were bloody useless. What they were using were mashur, these trays you could scrape rocks into and then throw away with ease. Now, I had no experience of this. It was completely new. So I started to learn a lot about the environment whilst I was there, but it did do one thing as we moved into doing formal survey. We realised that there was no larger formal database of archaeology on the island against which we would set the results of the detailed field survey on the Starograd Plain. Now, that immediately said, right, that was going to be my PhD. I was going to work with Branko, I was going to work with Nikša Vojnović, and we were going to create a database. We'd pull together all the information they'd been working on. We would put it into a formal database. It would provide the chronological backdrop for this larger work, which it was quite obvious would be really very important. Now, at that point, the other technical backdrop came into play, because archaeological databases were pretty crude at that point in time. I mean, I had a Foxbase, a very basic database which we was using, a couple of pretty rubbishy computers, an Amstrad PCW, which was little better than a typewriter, an Epson HX20, which was one of the first mobile portable computers for geophysics. I brought this, but it clearly this wasn't adequate for the work that we were likely to be doing. I admit I wasn't sure what we could do that was better at that point in time, and the big change came with my meeting Zoran Stančić. Now, Zoran, who was a researcher, a former geodetic surveyor, moving into archaeology, was notable for two things. One, my first big trip by road down to the islands, when we had this red Zastava van, which the department used, and we were going to drive a lot of equipment down there. And I had only learned to drive to come to Yugoslavia, and I was faced with driving this van with Zoran down to Hvar. And the first thing I did was turn it round in Tabachna in Ljubljana and get the van stuck. It was only just small enough to get through this opening, and I managed to get it stuck. It took a 360,000 point turn by Zoran, I think it was, to get the van the right way, to get out the building, never mind drive it down to Dalmatia. Once we started driving, it was then we realized that if you press the accelerator onto the floor of the van, it stuck. So you had to lean down and pull the accelerator back up to control the van. So we're going over the Dinaric Alps with a van which was stuck in accelerating mode unless you pulled the accelerator up. So that was interesting. But I got to know Zoran pretty well. And then something happened which was important, because he'd been at a conference and he'd met Ishmael Williams, a guy from the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. And Ish Williams introduced Zoran to something called GIS, Geographic Information Systems. Now, I'd not heard of this.
In which year was this?
Oh, that must have been 1989, I think. Zoran, you can tell me if I was wrong when you first met Ishmael Williams. You're there?
You're right, 89, 88, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and Zoran said, this is something we should do. And I always took Zoran's advice. I mean, look, he's had a real career. Man to listen to. And so we had a plan. We decided that we would go to Arkansas, Fayetteville, Arkansas, and where Ishmael Williams was based, where a guy called Fred Limp was, who would help work on the GRASS, the Geographical Resource Analysis Support System, which was one of the first big GISs, and we would work on the Havar data together. So Zoran would do the environmental data, I would do the archaeological data, and we'd meet in Fayetteville, Arkansas for 2 weeks to pull everything together and do an analysis of all the work on all the data we've been collecting by then. By then, Miksha, Branko and I had got, I don't know, 600 archaeological sites into a database that could be used. So we headed off. Zoran went out first. This was important because one, he did a grand tour of the West to meet Ken Kavami, who's the great grandfather of archaeological GIS, and two, to organise the parties before I arrived in Fayetteville. So by the time I arrived in Fayetteville, and it was a one-horse town in those days. It's not now because Walmart now owns the town. But when we arrived, it was relatively laid back and everything. And I was met by a crowd of people waiting to meet me and have a good time. So we got in there. Zoran sorted out most of the competing issues, but we had loads of support from other people, and we had a great time. We had 2 weeks where we partied hard, we studied hard, and at the end of 2 weeks, I had such a good time, I almost missed my flight out because I got the date wrong, and I only realised I had to be out of the country with a couple of hours to spare, and they had to rush me to the airport to get me out. But we've had such a great time, and from that 2 weeks' work, we published GIS Approaches to Regional Analysis, which was the first large archaeological publication on GIS in Europe at that time. And it was great fun.
Yeah, so can we say that Project HERISTEM in general and with all these sub-projects was somehow, let's say, the initialization into the higher academic archaeology into your career? It actually boosted you after this.
Oh God, yes. I mean, I can't stress that enough. I could not have made the linkages that I did do without having been in Yugoslavia. Now, it is very important to note, I think, that one of the characteristics of researchers, young and old, in former Yugoslavia, was their mobility. They had a good language, and they had a structure which largely respected academic achievement, and they encouraged mobility to get experience. Without that, I could never have made the contacts that we did. The actual language capabilities of all the people I met were remarkable. I mean, it is to my shame that I'm not a great linguist. I do, however, still have the book which taught me my little bit of Slovene, Zakaj Nepo Slovensko by Joža Toporišić. but wasn't very good actually. But don't tell him that. It was important to make those contents, and I couldn't have done it without.
Yes, because at the same time as you worked in Dalmatia, also John Chapman worked in area of Zadar, but he had a longer story with Yugoslav research.
Absolutely, and John Chapman and John Bintliff and I did a publication on Yugoslav archaeology in the, when was it, about 88, I think. 87 was it, from my memory, and that was great. I mean, John is an inspiring personality in almost every respect. Innovative. He's never been anything other than innovative, and always willing to help. A beautifully loose cannon, if I may say, in how he acted and thought. And no, I valued John's approaches very much.
So after you walked across the whole island, yes, you obviously, as one proper Yugoslav would do, you obviously wasn't satisfied with the pieces of land that you might have used as a weekend cottage, so you moved to the other islands.
Yes, I mean, we well, of course, at this point in time, from about 91, Yugoslavia was itself falling into you know, the tragedy of the various wars that pulled it apart. Now, during that period, I mean, I was out on the island, very much by myself in terms of the foreign research structure. I'd met John Hayes, I'd met Tim Kaiser through the Hvar project, and as we discussed features, and I'd finished my PhD in 1992, they said, well, first of all, what about doing some work on Eastern Hvar? Western Hvar is always being looked at. Everyone who's got half you know, anything at all about them will always look at Pharos, the Starograd Plain, and the great remains there, but the Eastern Hvar is rarely touched. And we started working on survey around Zastrozhice and Police on Eastern Hvar. But then, as time went by, we don't think we should. It is obvious that these islands don't exist by themselves. They're all interrelated, and to understand the archaeology, not just of the islands, but the region, you have to look at them holistically. They formed quite clearly an archipelago which stretched across the Adriatic. I mean, as you go up from Greece, it's the first time you can sail by line of sight across the Adriatic. But also, if you go north-south, you go to the great cities in northern Italy, Ravenna and the like. But if you turn right on land, you've got the great passes at Clis, at Omij, which take you through the Dinaric Alps up to ultimately Zagreb, into Bosnia. All of these things were tied together at this point. And we thought, well, if we're going to do this sensibly, you have to look at all this group of islands as a whole in order to make sense. Now, of course, at the beginning of the time I got there, Vis was a military island. Only Yugoslavs were allowed on there, and the Slovenes, of course, were very welcome to come and drink all the wine. They were famous for that. Getting in Vis, but I could only look at it from the hills of Hvar. That was as close as I could get. But it gradually, obviously, with the end of the war, it became an open island. Zoran got a grant from the EU to look at Brač, so that was good. Things were coming together under a holistic banner of what became the Adriatic Islands project, to look at this geographical node across the longue durée, if you wish. And that's how things became to develop with Ljubljana, Split, Bradford, but then Birmingham, because I got a job in 1992 in Birmingham, and Canada as a grouping of academics taking that forward. I mean, massively exciting. I've got to say to
you, probably one of the most interesting episodes was excavating at Palagruja.
Oh, well,
something worth remembering.
Yeah, well, I mean, Palagruja is interesting because in 1992 we were doing survey inside Pharos itself. We were literally going into everyone's gardens and doing field survey in the back gardens to try and find out about the extent of the colony. And we got to the end of this in 1992, and I was talking to Branko, and I said, Branko, we've got a bit of money left over. Under no circumstances am I giving it back to the British Academy, so we've got to spend it. I said, what can we do that's useful? And he said, well, the thing to do would be to go to Palagruja. You know, those little islands right in the centre, and they're interesting. I think the last archaeologists had been Mitja Petric from Hvar, who had been out briefly and did a small amount of work there. And before that, Richard Burton, the great anthropologist, had visited the island briefly. So anyway, we headed over to Hvar town. We've been in Starigard, we went over to Hvar town, and to get a small boat out to Palagruja. Now, that was the first time I met Marin Zaninovic, who saw us off, the great Zanzi, and we head off. There was me and my girlfriend, my wife Helen, who a number of people know, and we went off on the small boat from Hvar. Now, that was madness. It was madness. I mean, anyone with a slight sense of any good sense would have gone to Vis and sailed from there. We headed off in a small boat on a great Mediterranean swell. It wasn't big waves, it just went. Now, I may be of the race of Nelson, but the fish ate Italian that night. My wife and I were horribly seasick for 11 hours. There's a photograph of Slobodan Chacha and Branko Kirigan looking down on us with utter dismay and disdain. It was just terrible. I mean, we were so ill. That photograph that you've got was when we arrived on the island. And of course, it looks great, but we're only there for a very short time, 11, 12 hours, I can't remember now. But at no point during that time did the island stop moving for me. I was feeling ill for the entire time. And we got there, and we brought everything for a stay there. We had the food, we had the wine, we were all ready until we said, who's got the fines bags? At which point we'd realised we'd prioritised the wine over the fines bags. Yeah. And we had everything that we could find to do a small amount of survey. Was corralled. It wasn't quite. We weren't quite using our pockets, but it wasn't that far off. And it was during that time we started to realise just how critically important this island was. It was the point at which you could see to the east to the islands and onto Croatia, and the west to the Trinity and onto the western Italian coast, which meant this was the hub of travel and using early sails. Now, I did not dig at Palagruja. That was passed on. There were other people who took on that. Stasho's in here. He has written the book on the island, and you know that is wonderful. It was brilliant to have had that chance to see it, if only for a short while. Of course, at that point in time, we could also, whilst we were there, we could see the Italian smugglers on their fast boats coming down to illegally export Croatian lobster for the restaurants of Venice at that time. So it was really the Wild West, as it were. But it was a fantastic experience and a critical one, I think, for understanding Adriatic archaeology and not just Croatian archaeology.
Yeah, after a while, when you stayed in Ljubljana and then researched also in Dalmatia, you must have realized such incredible varieties in the country of Yugoslavia. Have you been around in other places except in Dalmatia and Slovenia, or maybe you visited some conferences, some people in other parts of Yugoslavia?
Well, I was working obviously with people like Phil Mason up in Slovenia, and of course the contrast between Dalmatia and the Slovene coast is pretty dramatic. I mean, and there are good things there are good archaeological reasons for this. The geographic reasons, the protecting nature of the Dinarics, and the nature of islands. I mean, Slovenia, it's an interesting point. I mean, it's a pure observation. I mean, Slovenia and the area of the Dalmatian Islands, the Adriatic Central Dalmatian Islands, do have some aspects, characteristics which are very similar. Slovenia sits, as it were, in a bit of a crossroads as well. I mean, famously, you're an hour driving down to the Adriatic and an hour up to the Alps. In terms of the diversity of environment, and also the passes to the north and to the south. There's some comparison to be had there, but the nature of the archaeology, of course, was very dramatic, and Dalmatia set me off on a rather strange relationship with the sea. I mean, I've already demonstrated I was never likely to be a great sailor, but nonetheless, an interest in maritime archaeology, or marine archaeology, if not maritime archaeology, became a characteristic of what went later. So that was critical. And of course, the issue of computational archaeology came to the fore during this period. I'd had an interest in geophysics in one way or another before I arrived, but the capacity for logging and display was pretty minimalist. I was working in Slovenia, and we did quite a bit of geophysics up in Slovenia and in Istria with the Sepson HX20, which is a wonderful computer. It had a 1-inch printer in it, and you could print your geophysics out in 1 inch. What's that? 2.5 centimeters or something, a bit more perhaps, and you would print out each individual square of your geophysics using this tiny printer, and then you'd stick it onto a page, and gradually you'd get a picture of your site. However, the pixels or the cell size of the printer wasn't square, so that the bigger your site was, the longer it became in one direction, because the actual printouts weren't square. I mean, this was the sort of stuff that we were dealing with in those days. I mean, but the having your eyes opened to, first of all, softwares like GRASS and Idrissi, which was on another quite still widely used low-cost GIS, which was available on PC based, began to make huge amounts of a huge difference to me. I mean, by the end of the period, I realized I just couldn't cope with the amount of data that we were generating unless it was computationally based. So by the time I got back to Britain, I was watching what Zoran Stančić was doing in Ljubljana and founding a spatial analysis centre there, which was quite closely linked with the Centre for Spatial Archaeology in America at Fayetteville. Now, the thing that was different for me by the time that I was watching these developments both in Slovenia and America was by the time I was doing it, there had been two big differences. One, everything was moving to web delivery by the mid to late 90s. And the other point was that the opportunity of development of visual front ends for everything was becoming more and more important. These things were, the GIS was gradually losing its identity as it merged with web delivery and to visualization high fidelity visualization front ends in a way that we hadn't understood. We were working in the early 90s, and that was different. And that's a process which is still ongoing. About how the things we were dealing with as separate entities, geophysics, satellite imaging, and both raster and vector GISs were merging together into these large softwares which you could take what you wished from them.
I would like to now give floor also to some colleagues of ours if they want to pose some questions or some comments. So
I just have one comment and one question. First, the comment, I think, I mean, looking back at the history, of course, I'm getting very emotional. You know, this is what usually happens when we get older. But a lot of memories pop up. But I think, I mean, the comment which I would like to make is that, first of all, we were in that time in very specific situation and a lot of things were happening. And we were blessed by a wealth of extremely knowledgeable elderly colleagues from different fields, you know, and a lot of things were happening. So I think that was really a fantastic thing. And one other thing which I think was very good was that essentially we, by some kind of coincidence, were a good couple, you know, couple in a professional way, because you of course had very profound knowledge on archaeological theory, so you were putting the right questions, and I actually had this technological experience. So I think from that perspective, from mid-80s to early 90s, it was intellectually great environment. Yes. For all of us. And then additional thing, which was, I think, you talked about the success stories, but you know, so for me, it was very important because you know all the theory. I mean, know a lot about theory. You were able to put the right archaeological questions. And what was very important was that at the same time, we were able to translate them and use that technology. But the real added value, I mean, what made our joint work, if you talk about GIS, very attractive is that we had the sexiest possible data, you know. I mean, you know, if you compare with GIS work in that time on the other side of the Atlantic, I mean, and with the great archaeology of Dalmatia, you know, I mean, just when we were doing this kind of presentation, people were overwhelmed with the beauty and attractiveness of archaeology in Croatia, you know. So I think that all made things very nice to us. But anyway, the question which I wanted to ask you, it's a bit about, I mean, from my current perspective, you talked about funding which we got and so on. What will happen with Brexit? No, but you know, what does it mean regarding future research of you personally? And I mean, that's one thing, and then the thing which is linked to that, of course, is how are we going to wrap up all this? You're talking about 30 years of journey through Adriatic Past, but you know, we have a lot of publications are already out there. We have volumes in BAR on individual islands or several islands together. We have GIS books and a lot of articles, but is there anything missing? And I mean, and what will we do? What will you do in order not to fill up this gap? Thank you.
Right. Well, there's a couple of things. The most dismal of which, of course, is Brexit. You know, I've spent the last year or so apologising to nearly the whole of the European community individually about what my country has done. It's an outrageous act of self-harm. It's going to be for research in the near future, and particularly with COVID-19. We've entered dangerous and unsure research landscapes. I am, as a number of people will know, I've had the great opportunity to hold an ERC advanced grant for the last five years, working on the North Sea, and it has allowed me to charter large survey ships to work within the North Sea in a way that I could never possibly have done without it. As I come to the end of that grant, I don't know how to finish it properly at the moment until I can get back to outside of this room, back to the university, and get my colleagues to bring this thing to an end. And I don't know how large chunks of research and interdisciplinary and international research will be funded within Britain. We are likely to be pushed to one side. My team, my group, it's not mine, it's the team I work with in the advanced grant, goes from China, where the systems are, the computer systems are built, through to Cork, where we do paleo-environmental stuff. And that's how we will continue work at that level outside a European framework. I do not know. I just hope we'll be able to hang on in some sense. The second part of your question is the unfinished business in Dalmatia, which is real. We published 3 volumes on the work in Croatia, and quite a lot of other books and and articles. However, the final volume is not finished, and we are working on it. We have in the last year I did get a British Academy small grant to spend time on the island, pulling together all the work that we've done. I have to point out that Dr. John Hayes, who was an inspirational researcher, without whom most of Eastern Mediterranean archaeology surveys certainly couldn't work, had an accident about nearly 2 years ago now, and was unable to carry on his work. Branko Kirikin stepped into that and essentially has reassessed the entire pottery archive that we've been able to pull together as a precursor to publishing that material. And with Nick Scher, Stasho's help, Tim Kaiser, we are working on the final volume there, and it will come. This COVID-19 has not helped. I should have been out in both Slovenia and Croatia in the first 6 months of this year, and it's not happening, obviously. So we live in a parlous world. I made loads of great friends, and I should point out that all the farmers, all the townspeople of Hvar, of Starigrad, of Vis, all of these areas, all of these people, contributed to this. It was not possible without this. There were times they were a bit suspicious of me, and I was only accused of being a spy on one occasion. But they used to call me the British Gastarbeiter when I was on Hvar, the guest worker. And genuinely, I met so many wonderful people, and I hope that others will, in their own way, follow on from the work that has been done. But they will never, as Zoran said, experience they have the same experience. We really did walk across the island from, you know, Pellegrin to Suchai and to the north and down to Sveta Nedelya in ways that you couldn't experience. You know, we sailed in, you know, the fishermen used to pick us up every morning to sail out to Lying Islands, where I got a terrible caterpillar infection on one occasion. And the photographs are there to prove it, by the way. You really don't want to see them. But you know, it was a wonderful experience, and you have to understand, I was a working class boy from the north of England who just turned up and was pretty much accepted by everyone I met, from Ljubljana to Belgrade to Split and to Suchari. You know, and it was a wonderful experience.
Well, we also have excellent memories, and also we hope we will still share some more. So that's the reason why we have invited you.
I would like, first of all, to extend my warmest thanks to Professor Gaffney for sharing these wonderful memories with us, with some of us who've been monitoring the Hvar project from a slight distance, from Belgrade student days in the early 80s and mid 80s. And I was just, I'm very kind of inclined to try and to connect today's event to what we have been speaking previous weeks and on our previous web meetings. There are so many connections. You've been talking about your fieldwork experience, which is very interesting and exciting in itself, because it shows how archaeology works in a kind of a very direct way. And secondly, we were talking yesterday and several times before that about the mechanisms in which ideas, concepts, techniques, and people move between different archaeological communities. And your professional life is really a kind of a stellar example of shifting between different archaeological communities, and also raising different archaeological and founding different archaeological extremely important procedures. So how does it feel to shift between archaeological communities, not only ex-Yugoslavian, Croatian, Slovenian, and British one, but also you've been working in other environments. Now you're working in an international network. How does it feel to shift between archaeological communities? Do you feel at ease, or is it a kind of a shocking experience moving between different traditions of different archaeological schools or collectives?
There are shocks. There are shocks. I think it would be appropriate to note that that much of former Yugoslavia fell within a Germanic framework of archaeology, and the tradition of what the Italians called the barone, you know, the grand old man of archaeology, was alive and well certainly when I arrived, and those were rather foreign to me because I hadn't experienced this before. But you know, do not get me wrong in thinking that I'm saying that my previous experience had been better. It had not. It had been different. That Yugoslavia helped create for me was a realization that my experience was not the be-all and end all of everything. I learned a lot from field workers and archaeologists and universities within former Yugoslavia to work elsewhere. I mean, I am thinking at the moment of work in Italy and Libya, where I've worked, two environments which are in some senses contrasting to or similar in some senses to some of my experiences in former Yugoslavia. But in every one of those, I benefited from the wisdom of work there, and I came out a better archaeologist. You know, as you go through life, if you are lucky, you will rely on the kindness of strangers. And I was lucky. I was lucky in that sense, and I hope I was open enough to learn from them. Every one of these archaeological traditions had much to offer. None of them, including the Anglo-American tradition from which I was brought up in, has the answer to these areas. There may be overarching positions, but everything in the end is regional, and that's great.
Thank you, Vince. Anyone else? Obviously, you gave us a lot to think about, to remember about. I hope that you also enjoyed being with us.
It's lovely. Thank you to everyone.
We are expecting you as soon as situation is allowing border crossings and things like this. Thank you again for sharing your time with us and your memories with us.
Thank you very much. This is another memory which I will treasure. I am the ultimate bad penny. I do keep coming back.